Boys and girls, the time has come for our next read aloud, and one of you guessed based on my clue, which was squirrel. And so the big reveal is, drumroll, Flora and Ulysses, or to be more precise, The Illuminated Adventures of Flora and Ulysses. Now, when a book is illuminated, it just means that there are illustrations that help to tell the story. And so every now and then, instead of reading, I will be showing you something. And I'm going to put it up really close to the screen so you can see. And just take time whenever I put it up. I'm going to give you a few seconds to really look at what's going on in the picture. And the very first chapter starts with a little comic. So let's see what's going on. So here we see a married couple, and she's reading a book of poetry, and she's not really paying attention. And so her husband goes, He says, "Happy birthday to you." She says, "What's this, Donald? This is your birthday present. It is a Ulysses Super Suction Multi-Terrain 2000X. Happy birthday!" "It's a vacuum cleaner." "It's a Ulysses 2000X. "Yep, it's the crown jewel of vacuums. It features an extra long cord, so there's absolutely no mess, no dirt is ever out of your reach. It's indoor, outdoor, it goes anywhere, it does everything." And she responds with, "Goody. You have to try it on. Turn it out. Or turn it on. You have to try it out. Turn it on," is what he says. And she says, "For heaven's sakes, Donald." And he says, "Please." So, going back to the pictures, she doesn't look too happy about getting a vacuum cleaner for her birthday. I don't know if I would be either. And so she turns it on, and then all this crazy stuff happens. And here's how that starts. I like how the vacuum cleaner is drawn to kind of look like it has eyes and it's going crazy. But it starts sucking up everything in sight. It sucks up her book, the rug. Things are kind of going out of control. And she says, "What in the world, Donald?" And he goes, "It's multi-terrain. You should try it outside." So he's not really concerned yet. And that's how it all began. With a vacuum cleaner. Really. So that was sort of like the introduction. And here's chapter 1. Chapter 1, A Natural-Born Cynic. Flora Bell Buckman was in her room at her desk. She was very busy. She was doing two things at once. She was ignoring her mother, and she was reading a comic book entitled The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. So I say it like that, and I will say it like that every time, because in this book, the title of that comic is always in a different font. And so I feel like that means they want us to read it differently. "Flora," her mother shouted, "what are you doing up there?" "I'm reading," Flora shouted back. "Remember the contract," her mother shouted. "Do not forget the contract." At the beginning of summer, in a moment of weakness, Flora had made the mistake of signing a contract that said she would work to turn her face away from the idiotic hijinks of comics and toward the bright light of true literature. Those were the exact words of the contract. They were her mother's words. Flora's mother was a writer. She was divorced, and she wrote romance novels. Talk about idiotic hijinks. Flora hated romance novels. In fact, she hated romance. "I hate romance," said Flora out loud to herself. She liked the way the words sounded. She imagined them floating above her head in a comic strip bubble. It was comforting. It was a comforting thing to have words hanging over her head, especially negative words about romance. So here's Flora, thinking to herself about how much she hates romance. So her mother isn't such a big fan of comics, and Flora is. Flora's mother had often accused Flora of being a natural-born cynic. Flora suspected that this was true. She was a natural-born cynic who lived in defiance of contracts. So once again, this book has written that part in a different font. And to me, that means read it different. It's kind of a font that is meaning to say, this is like our comic book introduction to Flora. It's kind of like when you're reading a comic book and there's narration on top of the picture, that's kind of what those words are. Yep, thought Flora, that's me. She bent her head and went back to reading about the amazing incandesto. She was interrupted a few minutes later by a very loud noise. It sounded as if a jet plane had landed in the Tickums' backyard. What the heck? Said Flora. She got up from her desk and looked out the window and saw Ms. Tickum running around the backyard with a shiny, oversized vacuum cleaner. It looked like she was vacuuming the yard? That can't be, thought Flora. Who vacuums their yard? Actually, it didn't look like Mrs. Tickum knew what she was doing. It was more like the vacuum cleaner was in charge, and the vacuum cleaner seemed to be out of its mind, or out of its engine, or something. A few bolts shy of a load, said Flora out loud, and then she saw Mrs. Tickum and the vacuum cleaner were headed directly for a squirrel. Hey now, said Flora. She banged on the window. Watch out, she shouted. You're going to vacuum up that squirrel. She said the words, and then she had a strange moment of seeing them hanging over her head. You're going to vacuum up that squirrel. So there's that comic booky font again. So Flora kind of daydreams as if she's in a comic. There's just no predicting what kind of sentences you might say, thought Flora. For instance, who would ever think you would shout, you're going to vacuum up that squirrel? It didn't make any difference, though, what words she said. Flora was too far away. The vacuum cleaner was too loud, and also, clearly, it was bent on destruction. This malfeasance must be stopped, said Flora in a deep and heroic voice. This malfeasance must be stopped was what the unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper always said before he was transformed into the amazing incandesto and became a towering, crime-fighting pillar of light. Unfortunately, Alfred T. Slipper wasn't present. Where was Incandesto when you needed him? Not that Flora really believed in superheroes, but still. She stood at the window and watched as the squirrel was vacuumed up. Thwump! Holy bagumba, said Flora. And here's the view from Flora's window. See the squirrel kind of trying to run away. And we've got a squirrel in the front of the cover here. So we know that those things are going to come into play. All right. Chapter 2. The Mind of a Squirrel. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over to one thought: food. The average squirrel thoughts go something like this: I wonder what there is to eat. This thought is repeated with small variations. Where's the food? Man, am I sure hungry. Is that a piece of food? And are there more pieces of food? Some 6,000 or 7,000 times a day. All of this to say that when a squirrel in the Tickums' backyard got swallowed up by the Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going through his head. As the vacuum cleaner roared toward him, he did not, for instance, think, Here at last is my fate, come to meet me. He did not think, oh, please give me one more chance and I'll be good. What he thought was, man, I'm sure hungry. And then there was a terrible roar and he was sucked right off his feet. At that point, there were no thoughts in the squirrel's head, not even thoughts of food. Chapter 3. The Death of a Squirrel. Seemingly, swallowing a squirrel was a bit too much even for the powerful, indomitable, indoor-outdoor Ulysses 2000X. Mrs. Tickums' birthday machine let out an uncertain roar and stuttered to a stop. Mrs. Tickum bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. "Oh, for heaven's sake," said Mrs. Tickum. "What's next?" She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood. She looked around the yard. "Help!" she said. "I think I've killed a squirrel." Chapter 4. A surprisingly helpful cynic. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, "For a cynic, I am a surprisingly helpful person." She went out the back door. Her mother called to her, and she said, "Where are you going, Flora Belle?" Flora didn't answer her. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. I wonder what their relationship is like. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickums in a single bound. "Move out of the way," said Flora. She gave Mrs. Tickum a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and shook it, and nothing happened. She shook harder. The squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur. Vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered. His chest rose and fell and rose again. And then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt. She put a finger on the squirrel's chest. At the back of each issue of The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's favorite bonus comics was entitled "Terrible Things Can Happen to You." As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredictable thing might happen next? "Terrible Things Can Happen to You" detailed what action to take if you inadvertently consume plastic fruit. This happened more than you might think. Some plastic fruit was extremely realistic looking. How to perform the Heimlich maneuver on your elderly Aunt Edith if she choked on a stringy piece of steak at an all-you-can-eat buffet. What to do if you were wearing a striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descended. Run, locusts eat stripes. And, of course, how to administer everyone's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible Things Can Happen to You did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. "I'll figure it out," said Flora. "What will you figure out?" said Mrs. Tickum. Flora didn't answer her. Instead, she bent down and put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. It tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say it tasted exactly like a squirrel. Fuzzy. Damp. Slightly nutty. "Have you lost your mind?" said Mrs. Tickum. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth. She pushed down on his small chest, and she started to count. All right. That's the end of the first few chapters. We've met Flora. We've met some squirrel. We've met her neighbor, Mrs. Tickum, and her husband, who thinks it's a good idea to give vacuum cleaners as birthday presents. And we've heard from her mom, but we haven't really met her yet. Now, there's an important word at the beginning of this book, and that word is cynic. And it's a word used to describe Flora. So I want you to start brainstorming. Think about, what's Flora like? What do you think so far? What's her personality? And what might cynic mean? And try to use some clues about what we know about Flora so far. And we'll discuss that more whenever we get back from the holiday. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this. I love this read aloud, and I can't wait to read you more. All right, bye, boys and girls.